So good morning and welcome to KVEX training for alternate assessment, which is a CAP activity for being over 1% on alternate assessment eligibility. And if you will first take time to use the QR code by opening your iPhone and hovering over the QR code, it will bring up a Google Doc at the very top of the screen. You just click on that, and today's session is titled Alternate Assessment Training, September 3rd, 2021. And then you just put your school and make sure you get your email address in there, and that will give us an accounting of who has been trained. So you will need to make sure that you get that into that Google Doc, or let us know that you weren't able to do that so that we can figure out how to give you credit for this. You'll need to let your director know and make sure that we get you the link for the sign-in. So today's session, we're going to use and we're going to utilize this agenda, which has the alternate assessment presentation. This should be in your inbox. Your director should have sent this to you. And then we're going to have the record review for alternate assessment that we're going to look at. The presentation is going to kind of give us some information. The record review is going to kind of be a guide or some type of assistance for us so that we can know what we're running through. And then your ARC considerations for alternate assessment down there is a guide as well. And then that record review would be like a scoring guide, if you will. And so certainly you will use all of these, and we will go through these with you as we consider all of the things that are going to be necessary to correctly document the need for alternate assessment and for those students that are going to need to be assessed using this alternate assessment. And we'll go through the guidelines. We have the participation guidelines hot linked for you. We got the alternate assessment parent guide. All of these tools are going to be necessary. We also have our own KVEC record review annotated document that's going to give you some information about documenting your decisions for alternate assessment. We also have our IEP coaching tool, which is a companion document to the KDE coaching or the KDE IEP guidance document. And so certainly without further ado, we're going to get right into the presentation. This presentation was done in cooperation with several of our co-ops. Of course, myself being a due process consultant here, and Brenda Combs being our director for monitoring and results. We have collaborated on this as well, and so this is where this training comes from, and this incorporates all of those tools that we showed you previously on the agenda. So we'll go back and forth between those all day, and we'll work diligently to get you through the information and then provide you the support. So we want to think about, when we look at this picture, that when you think about and you consider all the things that students have to be exposed to using the academic standards, the Kentucky academic standards, there's tons of intricate details and steps, and there's tons of skills that are involved. And so you have so many rocks in your daily sandbox that you have to expose students to. And with the alternate assessment, we have to think a little bit differently. And so we want to show you, and ask you these questions. What are you focusing on as an ARC chair in ARC meetings? And then it's good to reflect on what we should focus when we're discussing alternate assessment. And so when we consider alternate assessment, it's important to understand the big picture behind alternate assessment from a state and federal level. We know that anytime we forge beyond 1% of our total population is for students with disabilities, with having that student population go beyond 1% of those being on alternate assessment, then we're going to be needing to review our practices and procedures. So the big concepts, we're going to use this least dangerous assumption. We're going to use the least dangerous assumption by considering that all students can learn, and all students can learn to a great and driven detail. And so we would only need to create training around the fact that there's going to be a very small percentage of our students that are going to need these additional supports and going to need to be assessed alternatively. So all students can learn if we teach in a way that they can access the content. So the thinking here is that we can give access to the content if we can effectively teach, if we can provide those bridges, if we can close those gaps, if we can provide communication services, if we can do all those things for students, then in fact we're going to need a very few percentage of students to be on alternate assessment. So we presume that we have competence, and that if we can teach in a way that we can provide access to the content, then the students will not need to be alternatively assessed. So we embrace the power of yet, the most powerful three-letter word in the English language, in that we are going to continue to work with students to provide this access, close these gaps, give them the assistive technology that they need to close these gaps and to provide this access, and that we are eventually going to get there for those students, and we're going to have that learning to where they can demonstrate that they've had access to the general curriculum, they've had access to the standards, and they've made progress, and they've been provided a free, appropriate public education. So let's get organized. Let's think about what we, you may need some pen to take some notes. You might need a highlighter. If you've previously ran off these things that we have linked, we have the participation guidelines, we have the review documents, we have the parent guides, we have some of our own tools that we've created here at KBEC, and we have the KDE guidance documents for ARCs, which is very, very important as our guideline for what we're needing to do. And so let's think about getting organized as we proceed. Now, right here you have a screen grab of the Kentucky Participation Guidelines, and certainly when you are considering students for alternate assessment, you're going to have to take them through each and every one of these questions. Each and every time you update or do an annual review, you're going to have to reconfirm this information, and there's several things that are documented here that need to be documented each time. So we don't want to fail to think about each time we have an annual review, we have to go through this process again. And so there's several things that are linked here, and you'll certainly need to go through. And the one thing to remember about this participation guidelines is that every answer in the check boxes have to end up being yes in order for the student to be eligible to participate in the Kentucky alternate assessment. You can see up there that you have two places you can go. You can go for further clarification. You can go to the Admission and Release Committee on Participation Decisions, and we're going to go through that document quite a bit today. And then also all answers to participation criterion must be answered yes in order for the student to be on alternate assessment in Kentucky. And so we really wanted to point that out. So here we have the guidance for admissions and release committees on participation decisions for the Kentucky alternate assessment. This is really like I said, this is the how-to manual. This is the directions that we're going to follow, and it's going to capture and it's going to have guiding questions around all the areas that we're going to have to answer questions that are going to meet those participation guidelines, and that we're going to document definitively the need for these students to be on alternate assessment. So these are the directions. And then of course we have the participation guidelines for alternate assessment, the review document, and that's going to be our scoring guide. So we're going to have our step-by-step directions on everything that we have to document, and then we're going to go through the guide and see if we're meeting the mark and if we're in fact capturing the spirit of what we need to be capturing from these decisions that we're making for these students. This is a very difficult decision for a lot of parents. It's a very, very important decision for lots of students because of the nature of what we're deciding here. And so we certainly want to make sure that we're doing everything we can carefully and documenting carefully for our students to make sure that the outcomes that we get with our students with disabilities are in fact the outcomes that the students deserve and the outcomes that are needed in order to show that we've provided a free, appropriate public education for students in this regard. And so we got of course this linked here, the guidance, and then we want to point out for you that pages 3 through 8 are a great resource for districts on the process. And in particular, page 8 really has a great visual representation of what has to be documented, all the things that have to go into the conference summary, all the things that have to be documented on the participation guidelines, the learning characteristics inventory, the IEP, all the things that we have to do for students in order to make this whole process work. And so we wanted to point out that pages 3 through 8 provide great resources and great information for districts on the process itself and understanding the overall process. Page 9 also is a great resource for parents because it goes into a great detail about the alternate assessment, the diplomas that you get from the alternate assessment participation, and the difference between the diplomas and that kind of thing. So you've got a lot of information starting there on page 9 that are going to be very vital for parents as they consider this and as they make their decision as they move through this process. And then also follow this document, it aligns with the record review document for participation guidelines as well, which is another document that is out there for us. There's a participation guidelines record review document that also provides that how-to and gives us a scoring guide as well for those kind of decisions. And so as we look here, we see how it's arranged, and we see some very key pieces. We see that the options for inclusion in state assessments include these steps when we are considering the inclusion in state assessment, when we're considering that we need to first consider participation in the general assessment without accommodations, participation in the general assessment with accommodations, and participation in the alternate assessment with accommodations. And of course, when we're talking about 1% and we're talking about participating in the alternate assessment, that last option is going to be the option that you're going to select. And so, you know, you're just going to have to really go through that and discuss that. And you have to have, it says an ARC should discuss the possible participation in the general assessment for a student first, and then review the student information decisions for considering the student for alternate assessment only if the ARC agrees that the student is unable to participate in the general assessment with accommodations and modifications. And you see, you know, with your guiding questions, can the student participate in the general assessment with accommodations? If the student cannot participate, then it tells you what to do. If the student is an EL English learner student, the documentation that has to circle around that program service plan. And if the student is identified as EL with a significant cognitive disability, the student will participate in both the alternate access assessment for ELL and the Kentucky alternate assessment. And then of course you got your resources there that talk to you about these different populations and the inclusion for special populations and what training you have to get as a teacher in order to effectively work through this process for each population, either a student that's not ELL or a student that might be ELL. And so here is the overall process flow chart, parent guide provided, and diploma options discussed and documented. So that's going to be the first thing. When we go to review files, we're looking to see, and when the state looks to into your files to see that the proper documentation has occurred, the first thing we're going to want is a discussion around the parent guide, when the parent guide was provided, and how we went about that, and whether we allowed all the ARC participants to ask questions around the diploma options and discussed and documented that carefully, and also that we've discussed and documented that the parent understands the guide, the parent understands the diploma options, and that we've captured that discussion. And then as we move across the flow chart, we see that we have to answer all 4 participation criteria required for eligibility, and we have to discuss each of those criteria in our conference summary, and we have to document that in the conference summary as well. We have to always establish that the student is ARC eligible and that there has been a determination of eligibility through the update of the annual IEP, and we have to document and we have to provide dates, and there's those dates that are required. You're going to see that in your participation guidelines. And you're going to see that in that as you answer those questions, you document this stuff. You're going to have to document the students eligible and that they need these services and they need to be assessed in this particular way. And so the eligibility update for each year has to confirm that there's an IEP, that the IEP is current, it's in effect, and that it in fact documents the need for these types of services and these types of assessments. Documentation questions completed on the learner characteristics inventory. There's more dates that have to be considered there, and there's also a communication plan that needs to be documented. You have to verify the student's level of communication in the present level, and then you have to document the need or the lack of a need for a communication plan. And if you have a need for that communication plan, then you would have to document all those needs and how that you're going to implement that plan on the IEP. That's part of the IEP. It can be either documented in 2 or 3 places, and we'll go through that as we look at the nuts and bolts of the record review document itself. But just know that you're going to have to document that communication plan. If there's a need for a communication plan and the student has that need, then you're going to have to document that in the present level, in the special factors. You're going to document it through goals or supplementary aids and services, and we'll go through that again as we move through this training. ARC discussion must be documented, all 4 criterion met, and all sources of evidence are documented in the conference summary. So that, in a nutshell, is everything you have to do around that documentation process that's going to provide you with the proper documentation and a folder that is compliant and that's going to meet the letter of the law in terms of what it takes to be effective for students' outcomes and also eligible for this type of assessment. So we see here that Kentucky Alternate Assessment Participation Guidelines documentation form, and we see that any ARC member, including parents who need further clarification of any terms or criteria used in these guidelines, we have some additional information here, and all answers to participation criteria must be answered yes in order for that student to be eligible. And so we got that documentation there for you, and that's just a rehash of what we talked about a little bit earlier, but it is important. We see that these decisions, this guidance for these decisions, are housed there in the Guidance for Admission and Release Committee, and we also see that most of those, or all of those answers have to be yes in order for the student to be able to participate. So as we get into the participation guidelines form, we start looking at particular information. The first one was the parent was provided a copy of the alternate assessment parent guide with an opportunity to ask questions. If yes, indicate below when the guide was provided to the parents. If no, provide a copy of the alternate assessment parent guide and an opportunity to ask questions. And of course, you've got to document all that discussion, and you've got to document when you provided that to the parent. This is a big decision for a family, so we want to be empathetic. We want to make sure that we provide this parents enough time to make this big decision, because it's going to have some far-reaching implications for this student's education as they move forward. So here we see the parent guide for alternate K-Prep. This section of guidelines require the ARC to provide this parent guide and to the parent and give the parent opportunity to ask questions. So you can see that this is in page 10, and when it says remember to document in the conference summary that the parent guide was given, and documentation of any discussion of the parents' questions they had or any further questions when sending home an invitation for an annual review. An ARC may want to include this as a best practice to send this, go ahead and send it with the annual review notice, and a copy, send it in their native language, and a link to the parent guide for the inclusion of special populations as state required assessment and accountability programs, and document when you sent that home, and document that you sent it with the invitation, because that is a good practice. Again, here's just reminders. We have to document these things to pass that participation guideline. We have to make sure why we say we're going to say this is what we're considering. This is the data that supports the decision, and this is why the decision was made. So why, the capturing of why the decision was made is also very important. And so we'll need to capture that, and that'll need to be individualized for each student and be pertinent and relative to their particular situation. So you can see the guiding questions that are in your guidance document around this first participation guideline. Was the alternate assessment parent guide provided? Was that given to them in their native language? and did they have an opportunity to ask questions, and did the ARC document the discussion of questions, or that the parent did not have any questions. So certainly it gives you some step-by-step instructions here. Remember, we told you this was your instruction guide, and then we're going to look to see that from the record review document that you meet the mark, that you get a good grade, that you pass the compliance piece, and that in fact this student is eligible for participation in alternate assessment. So here's another good piece to consider. This is what we do if the parent was not in attendance and the attempts that were made to contact the parent. So certainly that's something we want to really consider as we move through, and we want to make sure that we capture how we made contact with the parent and how we got these questions answered, and how we made sure that they got a parent guide before we moved on. If they had questions, those were considered, and that kind of thing. Okay, right here, as we move through to the next section, the Admission Release Committee has explained the difference between an alternative high school diploma and a regular high school diploma to all ARC members, and participation in the Kentucky Auburn assessment stated in the IEP and based on the annual review. So we got to capture that. So how can we do this? Let's dive deeper. And here's what it says on page 12 of the guidance document. If the severity of an exceptional student's disability precludes a course of study that meets the high school graduation requirements, an alternative course of study shall be offered. A student who completes this alternative course of study shall receive an alternative high school diploma, which is not equivalent to a regular high school diploma. So you need to have that discussion. And the high school diploma means that the student has completed the required course of study with a minimum number of credit hours as required by 704 KAR and any other additional applicable local district requirements. For an alternative high school diploma, this is provided to students with significant cognitive disability who are unable to meet requirements for a regular high school diploma and complete the required course of study. If the severity of an exceptional student's disability precludes a course of study that meets the high school graduation requirements, we then have to document that the parents understand the difference between the two, and then we point them to the minimum graduation requirements in Appendix D on the KDE's website here for the description on the alternate assessment. We'd have an appendix that is with this guidance here on ARC participation decisions, and then Appendix E includes an example schedule for students completing the alternative course of study, including both regular and special education courses. So you're going to have that discussion about the difference between these two, and you're going to verify that the parent in fact understands the decision that's being made. So you see the highlight there of the difference between the two, and if you're on alternate assessment, in fact you're not going to be receiving the high school diploma, but you're going to be receiving the alternative high school diploma, which is provided to the students with significant cognitive disabilities that are unable to meet those requirements for the regular high school diploma, and they'll complete that required alternate course of study. The alternate high school diploma must include the Kentucky alternate assessment aligned to the Kentucky academic standards and the content strands of Kentucky employability and foundational academic standards. So we have to make sure that when we're developing the IEP that we understand that we're providing that access, and we're providing those big rocks around those standards, that the standards are the same, and we're providing that big rock understanding around those particular foundational standards that are mentioned here. The alternate assessment diploma requires a minimum of 22 classes, and it says in order to learn more here you can go to Appendix D and look exactly at that link and see that from that guidance on the ARC participation decisions for Kentucky alternate assessment. Here you see a course description that's linked, and that's there for you to consider. And then again, another course description for special topics around the Kentucky academic standards. As we're considering, we go back to this There's many steps, many skills, and many things that you have to cover. The depth and the breadth of what you have to cover in the Kentucky Academic Standards while a student is in K through 12 is really deep, and it's really wide. However, when we think about alternate assessment and we think about access to the standards, we think about those big rock pieces of information and demonstrating that the students have had access and they've made progress on the same types of information that any other student would be. So we just see this and we want to celebrate all kids as we think about this. But here we can see the going back and forth here. Here is straight out of the participation guidelines for Kentucky, the record review document. It's just asking here is the documentation there. That the parent was given a copy of the alternate assessment parent guide, that they had the opportunity to ask questions, and when that happened, and then we say, always it's important to read the notes under this. The ARC must provide a copy to the parent and must document when the guide was given to the parent and document in the conference summary if the parent did or did not have questions. And then in item B, we're looking at the alternative high school diploma versus the regular high school diploma, and it says the district must explain the differences, including the courses and the requirements and the implications of each to all ARC members, and gave those members an opportunity to ask questions about that process. So it's very important to hone in on, as we've got them highlighted and got an arrow to them, that we look at the notes around each of those items on the participation guidelines record review document. Conference summary documentation of this is critical, but here we want to say to you teachers, we know you've got this. We've just got to follow these step-by-step instructions, and we got to check it out with our record review document. And that's how things are going to go throughout the rest of this presentation. You're going to be looking at what the considerations are. We're going to be presenting the issues. We're going to be talking about the data. We're going to provide the evidence for the decisions we make, and then we're going to document the decisions that we make. So we're going to summarize the data being considered. We don't ever want to leave anyone with a cliffhanger here. We don't ever want to paint a picture and say these are the things that we've done, but never give any evidence as to why we've done them. So it wants to always read like we present the particular participation piece. We present the items that are up for consideration. We present the data to verify the need for these types of things, or to pass these participation guidelines with a yes. And then we say, here is the decision we made as an ARC. And so it's very clear, straightforward, no cliffhangers. So you can see how that discussion might emerge. The ARC reviewed Sam's current communication strengths and needs, and what happened. Based on this conversation, the ARC discussed these options, and what happened. The ARC agreed or decided that Sam was going to need this, and this, and this, and this is what we've decided for Sam. Here's an this is an alternate type of worksheet, a data analysis worksheet. It gives you the opportunity to consider data, both current data and longitudinal data, and to say whether that data supports the decisions that we're making, and whether or not the support is there currently, and whether we see that longitudinal connection between the data. What's the IQ score? What are the significant delays? What's the adaptive behavior say? What's the communication say? What's the significant delays? What are the academic needs? What's the progress monitoring say? What does the observations say? And do all of those support? So this is an optional piece of documentation, and certainly a good scaffold or a guide for you as you learn to answer these questions with data. And it's so important to have the data to support the decision. It's not a due process form, as we said. It's just one that you can use. So when we look at the participation guideline, we see also in this column here, this is what it says: has the student been determined to be a student with a disability? This is participation guideline number 1. Is the student eligible? and we answer yes. If we answer yes, then we're looking, is there a current IEP in place? We have to answer yes there. And so then we would say if no to any of these questions, then we have to determine if the student then would not be eligible for participation in alternate assessment. If the eligibility criteria has not been met and we can't determine and we can't verify that the student needs this and that the eligibility is in fact there and there's an IEP in place. And if both, then we move on. And you can see that we have to have the eligibility determination form, that's a required form, and the IEP form, and the dates for those forms need to be entered into this participation guideline form there for proper documentation. And so as we look at the alternate assessment record review, we see for participation guideline, did the ARC document the student is eligible for special ed services? Did the ARC complete and discuss the disability eligibility form? Did they document and date that form on the guidelines? And if they did, we give them a yes and we move on. And did the ARC document that the student has a current IEP or one that is currently being developed? And it tells you what to do if one is being developed down there at the bottom. You would go ahead and mark yes and include the date of the documentation that it's being developed. And so we just need to be mindful of that. So those two pieces for participation one must be in place, the eligibility and the IEP. So my student has a current IEP, now what? We have several things linked through the interactive agenda that we have done, the KVEC IEP coaching tool, and some checklists and things of that nature. They're going to take you through this process as well. And those are going to be additional tools that we feel are going to help you to ensure that you get the proper documentation and compliance in your paperwork. We know that students who participate in alternate assessment typically fall into these following categories: autism, functional mental disability or FMD, multiple disabilities or MD, traumatic brain injury or TBI. And we've have you just use the IEP guidance document record review to document to ensure that the IEP is developed appropriately. That's the question. And so we got some tools linked for you to be able to do that. We've got exemplar IEPs. We've got a bevy of resources for you that we've developed, that we've adopted from KDE, we've adopted through our collaboration with the other 8 co-ops in the state, and we certainly have all of that at our fingertips that we can provide you with technical assistance. We can come out, we can look at your documentation, we can coach you, we can give you some tips and pointers, and certainly we'll be happy to do that. So don't feel like you're all alone in this. And so, you know, one of your key words here is going to be documentation. The ARC members can reference the date of the IEP and when or if the IEP is being developed. We look at the sources of evidence and review, check, and date and discuss the sources of evidence and justification. Make sure we get all that in the participation guidelines, and then we move on. This is you know, if we have an IEP and we have an eligibility, and you know, that it's typically those eligibilities that we discussed in the previous slide. So make sure we review, check, and date and discuss specific sources of evidence and justification, and we have those dates properly documented. And that if all answers are yes, then we can move on to criterion number 2. Again, no cliffhangers. We want to document in such a way that we're going to capture what we're doing, why we're doing it, and we got the justification and we got the evidence to support the documentation. And here again is another, as we move on to participation guideline criterion number 2, the student has demonstrated cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior in the home, in the school, and the community environments. Remember when we looked at that sheet that we said it was an optional form? We're looking at the current functioning and we're looking at the longitudinal functioning across all of those settings, and we have to document and verify that even with the use of program modifications and accommodations, that we are still going to need this, or we're still going to see that the level of significance is far below the age expectations, and that the actual performance of the student is far below age expectations, even with the use of those accommodations and modifications. And then we got the ARC reviewed current and longitudinal data across settings, age-appropriate home, school, and community environments in all academic areas, and adaptive behavior to inform the ARC decision. So we're going to look at those and we're going to consider them, and we're going to provide the evidence that supports this. And it's when we look for the sources of evidence in the column. If we answer yes to both of these, yes, the student demonstrated the cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior, and yes, this happened across time, longitudinally, it is happening currently, and we've seen evidence in all of these consistently environments, in all of these environments consistently across the home, the school, and the community, and the need for this emerging in both academic pursuits and functional pursuits, and it's documented well in our sources of evidence. So we see here, as we move over, the evaluation data is required, the IEP is required, the date's required, the previous IEP is required, so we can get that longitudinal data in there. Progress monitoring data is required, and teacher observations are required. Are optional, and then supporting comments are optional. So you got to have those required pieces of data. You've got to have some progress monitoring data, and you got to make sure that the IEP is current, that you've got evaluation data that supports your decisions. And again, we're considering these things for this student. We're providing the evidence, and then we're documenting the decisions that we've made based on these pieces of evidence. So we see longitudinal data is collected and analyzed over more than 1 year at multiple points of data over time, and that current data is collected within the current year. And then also those pieces where we need to document are there. So here we're comparing the same age peers in the general ed classroom. We're not comparing to other students with disabilities. And we're looking at how far these students are away from age expected performance within the standards, and documenting what it is that they are able to do and what they're not able to do, and what their needs are and what their barriers are, and the need for this significant difference in their program. Here's a note that says, make sure that when you're using rating scales, that the person that is performing those rating scales are completely trained on the particular use of that, and that they know that how that is going to work. So that is certainly something that you would need to, in fact, pay close attention to, is that the people that are doing your rating scales are trained to do so, and that you're comparing these students to their same age peers and their performance in the general curriculum in the general education classroom. And then you're going to ask that, how does my student or child do in this task compared to same age peers? So that's the question you're asking. How does my student do with all these things that are required in the standards? Are they able to do this, or do they need some significant modification? So when you're preparing to answer question 1 before the ARC, you want to consider some things. Is the student's demonstrated cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior in the home and community environment significantly below same age peers, even with program modifications and accommodations? Typically, we're going to see these scores for cognitive functioning over time be pretty consistent. They're going to be in a range that's going to be 3 standard deviations or more below the mean, and the same for the adaptive behavior in the school and community environments. And you're going to see the need for some real modification in order for the student to get the understanding that's required to complete the standard work. If yes, check the box, and the ARC must document the discussion of this decision and the sources of evidence. So you're going to look at, is the student's demonstrated cognitive functioning below or at a level that's significantly below same age peers, and document that discussion. on the answer to question 2 before the ARC, the special education teacher or ARC chairperson must make sure all sources of evidence listed below are made available for the ARC members to review. So did the ARC review and compare the current and longitudinal data? Did they review the progress of the student and how it was impeded by the disability to the extent that the student's educational performance is significantly and consistently below the level of the similar age peers? Now look at this comparison here, or this description of current data. It's a data that's collected within the most 365-day recent period, and then the data that's collected longitudinally is going to be collected over more than 1 year. And so we need to think about both looking at those long-term and those short-term representations of the adaptive and cognitive scores. Did the ARC review and compare data across multiple settings and academic areas and adaptive behaviors? When the student has acquired skills and can apply the skills across settings, such as different classes, at home, at job, and in the community with different people and with a variety of materials. If they can't do it everywhere, then it's not a skill that they have. And so we need to really think about longitudinally what they can do and what they can do currently. I should say longitudinally what they have been able to do, and then currently what they're doing now. So again, on this participation, if all answers are yes, and they must be marked yes, and we've documented these decisions with our evidence in the conference summary, then we move on to the next criterion. And then when we look to see what's in, remind a student who qualifies for alternate assessment must meet both cognitive and adaptive requirements, okay, in order to be on the alternate assessment. Were we able to document that this student meets the definition of a student who has a significant cognitive disability? Let me back up here for a second. And was the adaptive behavior in multiple settings meeting the definition of a student who has a significant cognitive disability? And do the descriptions in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance section of the IEP support that the student meets this definition of having a significant cognitive disability, and it's documented in the current IEP and on the date of the IEP, the date of the evaluations, and when those occurred. So we need to make sure we have those all documented. Again, just highlighting that it's important to have these questions answered yes, and that we've got the sources of evidence to document and do so. So, participation guideline 3. Does the student require extensive individual direct instruction across multiple settings, utilizing intensive accommodation, modification, and assistive technology to access and make progress in the Kentucky academic standards and to maintain and generalize learning? And number 2, have the ARC reviewed current and longitudinal data across settings, age-appropriate home and school and community environments to inform the ARC decision? And the answers have to be yes there, and if they're not yes, then you have to stop at that point and the student wouldn't be eligible. Again, if they're both yes, you have some required data that you're going to have to get. You're going to have the IEP, the progress monitoring. You're going to have to make sure that all those required, and your parent input here is also required on this, because you're going to have some input from how they're doing at home for question number 2, and the need for this extensive individual direct instruction across multiple settings utilizing intensive accommodations, modifications, assistive technology. Again, here's what it looks like in the guide. It tells you exactly what extensive direct, this is repeated instruction and substantial supports that are not temporary in nature to achieve measurable gains in grade and age appropriate curriculum, and uses substantially adapted materials. So you have documentation of that, you have verification that that's occurring across settings, and you have to get that parent input in order to make sure that you get that well documented. Is there intensive accommodations, modifications, and assistive technology being used that exceed what's allowed on the inclusion document in the general assessments? Is there some evidence that acquires and maintains and generalizes and demonstrates and transfer of skills across multiple settings means when the student has acquired skills and can apply those skills across settings, such as different classes, at home, at a job, and in the community? If they can't do those across those settings, then they're going to be a candidate. And but you have to document that. The student's need for extensive, direct, individual instruction is not temporary or transient. His or her need for substantial support to achieve gains in the grade and age-appropriate curriculum requires substantially adapted materials and customized methods of accessing information in alternative ways to acquire, maintain, and generalize skills across multiple settings. That all has to be documented so that we capture exactly what we need. And these are the guiding questions that come from the participation guidelines or the guidance for admission and release, and what we're doing to make these decisions. Does the student require extensive, it lists that question. Does it require extensive individualized instruction across all settings? Does it require intensive accommodations and modifications to make progress? And does it need assistive technology to make progress? And if any of the questions are no, then we would stop. But if the questions are yes, and then did the ARC review the current and longitudinal data across settings and the need for these extensive individualized instruction, extensive accommodation modification, and extensive use of assistive technology to make progress and access the general curriculum. So we're going to review, check, date, and discuss the specific sources of evidence and justification required to determine the answer to the participation criteria. In the conference summary, document the ARC discussion of the sources of evidence and the ARC's justification for their answers to the criterion question. Then we're going to check it against what our record review says, and we see that item 3 asks you, does the ARC document the student's requirement or need for extensive direct instruction, extensive accommodation, extensive modification, extensive assistive technology in order to access, and do we see this across all settings? A note here again, all required sources of evidence must be documented in the conference summary. All answers to participation criteria must be answered yes in order to be eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. How do I document my justification in the conference summary? Big question that we have to consider. And so, with your supporting comments for this next section, we see having to go through a series of questions here that we sometimes refer to as exclusions or exclusionary factors. And so participation criterion number 4, did the ARC carefully consider each of these items? Excessive or extended absences? Is the disability related to other types of disabilities like visual or auditory disabilities, emotional behavioral disabilities, specific learning disabilities, or speech language impairment? Was the native language, social, cultural, and economic differences documented? And did that have a bearing on whether or not this student was eligible? Did we consider those identified as ELL? And did we jump or do all the things that we needed to do through those particular hoops in order to make sure that we're both assessing the English language learner the correct way, that we've allowed acculturation, we've allowed the English language learner to be in our environment long enough that we wouldn't predetermine them eligible for special education too soon? And have we predetermined poor performance on the grade level assessment? Did the student display disruptive behaviors or experience emotional duress during testing? Did the administrators just make this decision? Was this something that was done without much or careful consideration? And then the educational environment or instructional setting, was it something that would keep the student from progressing the way they need to progress? And then you would document your supporting comments. The ARC decision for the student to participate is not primarily a result of any of these exclusions listed above. So the educational environment and instructional setting didn't cause it. The administrator making the decision with little information didn't cause it to happen. The disruptive behaviors, predetermined poor performance, the fact that they were ELL, that they had differences through language, social factors, the cultural factors, economic differences, or that they had a different type of eligibility category that was impacting them, that would maybe possibly skew the data, and or did they not attend school enough. So we certainly need to look at those exclusions and make sure that yes, we agree that none of these is not a primary result of any of the exclusions. So we look at that column there and we see that we've got to answer all those questions, and we have to document all that and put any supporting evidence that needs to be placed with that in order to answer those questions. Again, no cliffhangers. We want to answer clearly that these exclusions did not occur and that the participation decision was not primarily the result of any of these exclusions. And again, this is what your guidance document said. Did the ARC carefully consider all the exclusionary factors listed? And you have to document each one of those and that you discussed each one of those. The ARC must carefully consider each of the exclusionary factors listed and document in the conference summary or in the supporting comments section of the guidelines that the ARC carefully considered all exclusions listed and did not base the decision to participate in the alternate assessment on any of the descriptions. And again, looking at those sources of evidence, we've got to make sure, and then we grade it against this particular record review document, and you see that we have to have discussion of all these factors. And look at the notes. Discussion of exclusionary factors must be documented in the conference summary. All answers to participation criteria must be answered yes. And so I wouldn't take any chance in putting it in one place or the other. If I marked it on the participation guidelines, I would make sure that I got some discussion over in my conference summary and not take any chances with that particular item. So again, how do I document it in the conference summary? I'm looking at answering these questions, considering each of these, and then I'm looking at putting that supporting evidence in there. Now look here, it says if the ARC has checked no to any of the participation criteria 1 through 4, then you would stop and this student was not be eligible for Kentucky alternate assessment. So we must document that the student in the conference summary that the decision is based on evidence and justification, and in fact they met all the criteria, all 4 participation guidelines, all the questions were answered yes. So again, the sources of evidence. Here's an example of how you would do that, how you might do that. This is from your guidance document from KDE. After reviewing all criteria for the participation guidelines, the ARC agrees that the student is eligible for participation in the alternate assessment and the student has a significant cognitive disability. The ARC should have documented each participation criteria discussion and decision in the conference summary and verified all supporting documentation used in making the decision. And please note this is just an example, but this is certainly the kind of documentation you should have, because it says you have to make a statement about this and you have to look at all 4 participation criteria, and then you have to make an overall statement that the ARC agrees that the student's eligible and that they have a significant cognitive disability, and you've documented that in all the decisions and verified all the supporting details and all the supporting evidence in the ARC documentation. And it should be individualized per student. And that we've looked at all sources of evidence and justification, and we've also documented that. So item C, did the ARC document a statement of its decisions, the reason for the decisions? Now again, this is your scoring guide. This is what you're looking at. And look at item C here. Did we have a statement in the ARC documentation in the conference summary that all the reasons for the decisions were made and can be backed up by referenced data sources and verified with supporting documentation? And then item D, is their documentation ARC reviewed and completed the learner characteristics inventory? And then you list the date that you did that. Is their documentation of the student's functioning pertaining to receptive and expressive communication are addressed in the IEP? Did we address receptive and expressive communication in the IEP? Note that students found eligible for alternate assessment, the ARC must look at the LCI and document that communication is addressed or mark as an area of concern in the IEP. So that's very, very important that the ARC must, in fact, document this. Looking at the LCI and documenting that communication is addressed or is not marked as an area of concern in the student's IEP. So there's that chance that the student would have that marked as not an area of concern in the student's IEP, but there's certain things you have to consider, and you have to look at the particular level of functioning and note, does the student use spoken language to communicate, and how that student communicates, and to what degree is their communication impacted by their disability. And so it's very, very important that we think about that as we move through. That's certainly something that's very, very important. So here's the screen grab of the participation guidelines form and the learner characteristics inventory. And so we see that we have to answer these questions. This has to be filled out in its entirety. And again, here's in Appendix F, there is some further documentation about what you have to do. It says addressing receptive and expressive communication. So the student's got a well-documented communication difficulty, and how are we going to address it? We must verify the receptive and expressive communication and that it's addressed in the IEP. The student must have a communication plan, or the student's IEP must document that communication is not an area of concern at this time, in which a communication plan would not be necessary. If a student's expressive communication on the LCI is rated as either pre-symbolic or emerging symbolic, then a communication plan must be developed and in place. So the documentation there, again, from the guidance document says that we verify the receptive and expressive communication as it is addressed in the IEP, and then we must have a communication plan on the IEP if the student has a rating on the LCI that's either pre-symbolic or emerging symbolic. Then a communication plan must be developed and in place. Now, this is further looking at this rating. If a student is found eligible for alternate assessment, the ARC must complete the LCI and document that communication is addressed or is not marked as an area of concern in the student's IEP. So certainly we would need to take this very serious, and we'd need to look at that. Linked in your IEP annotation, you've got some information about emerging and pre-symbolic and symbolic language and the use of that language and what you would need to do in order to attack that issue with some, supplementary aids and services, a goal, or whatever, in your special factors. How you're going to address that would also need to be verified and documented in your IEP. So 707 KR says a statement of decisions regarding for meeting the requirements of the alternate assessment, the IEP, the contents of the IEP. If the ARC determines the child meets the criteria, it shall provide a statement of its decision and the reason for the decision. So this is straight out of this is your regular compliance record review document. And so you also need to be aware of that. And certainly that is something that you would look at and be thinking about. Here is some of this information filled out. Remember, I said that this is a collaboration amongst our co-ops. GREC, our Green River Regional Educational Cooperative, provided some of the information here, and this was probably done in a task group at some point, or maybe GREC just did this all together by themselves. But anyhow, this gives you the participation guideline form and what you're looking at. You're looking at the criteria, you're looking at the diploma options, you're looking at the parent guide and what you need to do and where you need to document it and what the specific documentation is. And I really like this. We have this linked as well to this presentation so that you can use this as a guide to help you document all the things that need to be documented so that you're compliant. Here's page 2 of this. You can see it right here. You can see that there's some good information here if you answer yes to all the questions, what you have to document, and that type of thing. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. Again, we're going to go back up here to our presentation itself, and we're going to look, and we're going to see that you have the participation guidelines linked here. You got the alternate assessment parent guide linked for easy access. You've got the considerations for alternate assessment, which we really feel is key to understanding the directions on how to do this. We've got the record review document. We have some evidence-based practices for moderate and severe disabilities linked as a resource. We've got the IEP coaching tool, our annotated KVEC document, and of course this presentation is linked as well. And then right here at the end, we would like to hear your feedback. We would like for you to tell us, in fact, how it is that you would like to see this improved or make suggestions, and we take that very seriously. We would appreciate if you'd use your QR code, open with your IEP, or open with your, I'm sorry, not your IEP, but your iPhone, and open that Google document and answer those questions. Again, the topic of today's discussion was around alternate assessment. It's an alternate assessment training. That's the name of the training. Again, if you have questions, Brenda Combs, Dion Bates are our division leads here. I'm your due process lead, and we certainly have, you know our emails. If you don't know our emails, Brenda's is brenda.combs2@hazard.kyschools.us, dion.bates@hazard.kyschools.us, and then mine is denny.may@pikeville.kyschools.us. And certainly we would be willing to reach out and provide answers, find the answers for you around this alternate assessment documentation, provide you some coaching, come out and look at your files, and certainly we're going to work with each of you to help us get in a situation where we're compliant. We know the process, we know the things that we need to use, we know that we are going to present that the student is a candidate. The student presents with an IEP, they present with performance. We document that performance, and we document our decisions. And it's certainly important that we capture all those decisions as we move through. And so again, I'm going to put the link up there for you for the feedback. And without further ado, we'll say bye for now, but not completely goodbye. We'll just be seeing you around the corner as we continue to provide you with the resources and the support that you're going to need in order to provide our students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education. Thank you again, and we'll see you down the road.